student in Oxford,
Yes.
reading Oriental Studies, which is an old subject. We can do a number of languages. I did
Yes.
Arabic, Persian, Aramaic, and then we have broad interest in the Middle East, literature, culture,
Great.
history. So I particularly liked history,
Okay.
and I always was interested in that change from the late antique period and
Okay.
then going into early Islam. What are the changes in society
Okay.
that lead to the emergence of Islam and then for it to spread across the Middle East?
Yeah.
My supervisor was Patricia Kroner. She really was an amazing scholar, so it was
Yeah.
a great idea. So she was really inspiring.
Okay.
And her book, which she wrote with Michael Cook, Hagerism, The Making of the Islamic World,
Yeah.
took this radically different approach at the
Okay.
time, where it asked the question, what if we didn't look at the Muslim sources at all? We only looked at what the non-Muslims were saying, the Christians, the Jews and the Zoroastrians. Because my main question
Yeah.
is, are we justified
Okay.
in only using the non-Muslim sources to reconstruct the beginnings of Islam? Do they not also have their own biases and problems?
Okay.
And I think by the end I also realized that you can't really isolate
Okay.
Muslims from non-Muslims. Really,
Yes.
they're living in the same
Together.
society,
Yeah.
and although we obviously in our modern world we sometimes make these distinctions,
Okay.
for the time it wasn't really real. The people were much too living close together and part of the same environment and culture. So there's the direct connection, if you like, with the book Hagerism with Michael Cook and Patricia Kroner, where I'm looking at the sources they looked at and thinking whether we can really use them
Yes.
in this way. So, for example, they look at, so there's an early source called the Doctrina Jacobi, which
Okay.
is a Greek text. It's written in about 634. It's a fascinating text, actually, because it's posed as a conversation
Yeah.
between a Jewish rabbi and a student. And they've heard this rumor that there's a prophet appeared among the Arabs,
Okay.
and he's preaching about
Yes.
about the end of the world and having the keys to the kingdom of
Oh.
heaven.
All right.
They take this as a real
Okay.
preaching of Muhammad,
Yes.
so say that this was one of the doctrines of Muhammad. But we don't. The problem is also a Jewish doctrine. So how much is this Jewish teacher just putting on Muhammad this idea? How much was it an idea of Muhammad?
Yes.
And this is a problem the whole way through their book,
Okay.
is that we could just believe what the Christian or Jewish Zoroastrian source says, but maybe they're just giving their own perspective. Maybe they don't have that good knowledge, because how did they get access to the knowledge about Muhammad? Muhammad's way down in Mecca, 1,000 miles away, so did they really have good knowledge, or is it just rumors? And so these were some of my questions.
Oh, okay.
So that's the narrow connection. There's also a bigger question which started, well, it goes a long way back, but in particular with the time of the 1970s, when you had Patricia Kroner, Michael Cook, John Wansborough in London.
Yes.
They're all really asking, do we believe this picture
Yes.
that the Muslim sources written in the 9th century
Yes.
are telling us? Usually the history, when it's written by the winners,
Okay.
the victorious people, tends to represent only their point of view.
I see.
They ignore what the conquered people say. We have the right, we conquered, we are victorious, we have God on our side. So you could argue that they're giving a very particular point of view
Yes.
that may not be correct. So
Yeah.
for example, just to give a simple example,
Yes.
in the conquests,
Yes.
the Arabic sources will normally just say, and then God helped the Arabs and they were victorious. Yeah, so there's a couple of famous discrepancies, if you like, between Muslim sources and non-Muslim sources. And remember, the important thing about the non-Muslim sources is some of them are very early.
Yes.
So, 630s, 640s,
Yes.
really near the lifetime
Yes.
of Muhammad.
Yes.
Whereas the first Muslim Arabic history that we can really hold in our hands
Yes.
is from 822
Yes.
AD. So that's 200 years after the Hijrah. And this is always the problem.
Maybe
Maybe,
they're written.
yeah, the actual, a book that you could pick up and hold.
All right.
So there might have been other books, but here is where you get the real, beginnings of the argument between people who are more skeptical
Okay.
and people who are more accepting and traditional.
All right.
We don't have some history books from the 8th
Okay.
century in Arabic or the 7th century. The people who are more accepting will say, but that's because they were lost.
Yes.
But if you're a skeptic, you say, but maybe there weren't any. And actually it only starts in the 820s,
All right.
200 years later, and there wasn't anything before. So the problem is we don't have it, so we don't know. Either could be right. There's no way to properly decide it. And this is why they're a little bit antagonistic, the two views, because there's no way really to solve this. First, you can't just trust these non-Muslim sources and distrust Muslim ones.
Yes.
It's much more complicated.
Yes.
The Muslim ones have their problems, but so also do non-Muslim ones.
Yes.
My second point is that you can't really separate them.
Yes.
Patricia Cronin and Michael Cook used this phrase at the beginning of their book, Hayrism. It's like, we are going to step outside from the Muslim tradition and use these non-Muslim sources. But my point was you can't really step outside. The Christians, Jews, Muslims, they're living close together.
Yes.
And so they're not really separate. So their writings too are not separate. You have to take them together.
Yes.
And this is what I did with a couple of famous cases. So one of the examples they gave of what the non-Muslim sources say is that Mecca should be further north.
Yes.
It's kind of a famous claim.
Yeah.
So I took this and looked at it carefully.
Yeah.
And I realised you can't just say that the non-Muslim sources are right on this.
Yes.
There's other factors you have to consider. I mean, it's a very interesting question actually. What did the Muslims think that they were doing initially? And they seem to be saying it's okay to pray generally. So if you're in Iraq, you can pray south
Yes.
or east actually. By the 9th century, Muslim rulers had established a legal framework
Yes.
for governing non-Muslims.
Okay.
So they give them a proper legal status, they allow them to do this, they allow them to do that, they restrict them from doing this. It's all a very clear situation. That's what
Yes.
he looked at. I'm generally more interested in the process
Okay.
of how this comes into being.
Okay.
Because in the beginning, it's not really a religious situation, it's more conquerors and conquered.
Okay.
So as all conquerors, they tend to inevitably make a difference between themselves, the conquerors, and the conquered people. They have to pay taxes, they have to be loyal, maybe they have to give some support for troops, the conquerors, to put them up, to give them food, to give them help. So, but gradually this changes as more people convert to Islam.
Okay.
Then we get a situation where it's not conquerors and conquered,
Okay.
but Muslims and non-Muslims.
I see.
So there's a slow process of this change.
I see.
And so it's that process that I find very interesting. Older scholars tend to think that Islam is very fixed in the beginning, so we can just study that, and that's what Bernard Lewis did.
Yes,
I
because
like the idea or seeing things change, because all religions and ideologies change really. Yeah, this is a classic question. Often we find it for students in exams when they say, was Islam or Christianity more tolerant than
Yes.
other religions?
Yes.
And it depends how you look at it.
Yes,
In
of course.
the thing that Islam did very differently to Christianity is it gave a legal framework.
Yes.
So Christians were allowed to practice their worship and so on. And so if you tried to stop this,
Yes.
Even as a Muslim, you will be put in prison because that's wrong. You have to protect Christians, Jews, and others. But equally, there was a you were allowed to stop Christians building new churches. So it's good and bad. But the good thing about it is it was a clear legal framework. Whereas in Christian Europe, there's no clear legal framework. For a long time, these two opinions were a bit stuck.
Yes.
You know, you have skeptics say, well, we're going to say we don't believe any of it unless we can prove it's true. Whereas the traditionists say we'll believe all of it unless we can prove it's false.
Yes.
So this kind of stuck.
Yes.
So now people are trying to take different directions in their research. Not to say is it true or not, but how, for example, did the stories get created? How did the different ideas become elaborated? So they got more interested in the processes of change, not just true, false. So I wanted to do three things.
Yes.
One was to hear from different participants in the Arab conquest, not just the Muslim Arab conquerors.
Yeah.
There were actually many different groups among the conquerors. They weren't all Muslim and they weren't all Arab.
Yes.
This is usual. I mean, the British Army, when it conquered India, they used about 80% Indian local people. It's just what empires do, So I wanted to look at some of these other groups, the Berbers, Khazars, lots of other people who joined in what to them was just a really successful military campaign, and they wanted to be part of it. So that's one thing. Two, I wanted to, again, understand this process. Often it's said, okay, the Arab conquest happened, it's all very quick, it's finished in about 5 to 10 years. But in reality, it takes a long time. And there's a number of areas, like the Caucasus, Central Asia, the area of modern Pakistan, and also the area of Northwest Africa, where the Arabs and their allies encountered peoples like the Berbers and the Khazars and the Turks, who were also quite good fighters. They have tribal armies which they could put against the Arabs. And so it took a long time for the Arabs to establish. For many conquerors, they don't really want the conquered to join them. The British didn't say to all the Indians, you can all become British. The Romans, eventually they let people become Romans, but it was slow. But the really interesting thing in the case of the Arab-Muslim conquest is people were able to become Muslim and very quickly.
Yes.
And Islam provided this, if you like, social glue, this mechanism by which the conquered and the conquered could quite quickly work together to make this new civilization.
Yes.
I think it's partly because there's no hierarchy of like priests and so on as there is in Christianity, so it's more easy for everyone to work together within the religion. And secondly, Muhammad hadn't actually put any restrictions. Whereas, for example, to join Judaism, you should really do a number of things, and really you ought to have some Jewish ancestry, really. But there wasn't any restriction for Islam. And so it was very easy for people from any background, any social group to join. If you read Arabic chronicles, you'll find there are 3 peoples from before Islam that are always mentioned. This is the Israelites, because this is about the prophets of the Quran and so on. The Arabs, because they are the ancestors, if you like, for the later Arabs, and then the Persians. And it's interesting that the Persians are there because they were Zoroastrian, they were dualist. So in many ways, you might think they wouldn't be very popular. But because many Persians joined Islam quite early, and especially in the early Abbasid period, after the revolution from Khorasan, Persian Muslims become very important in this period of Islamic history, and so they're able to put their history into Islam and make it part of Islamic history. But the question is, where did all the knowledge about pre-Islamic Iran come from? Where does all this knowledge of the kings and and their battles, their buildings, all the knowledge of their empire. How did that get transmitted? And that was my question. How does this material become transmitted through time? So yeah, I took these three chronicles, Hamza al-Isfahani, Jacobi, and Mas'udi, translated some of them, and then thought about what is this material, what are the common links between them, and how has it come from the pre-Islamic period to the 10th century.